Are your hamstrings always tight? Well, most of the world wants you to focus on trying to loosen your hamstrings. We actually have a different perspective that we're going to share with you on this week's episode of the Exercises Health Podcast. We're going to cue our introduction and we're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health Podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios and Muscle Activation Schaumburg, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset. And the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie.
And today we are talking about tight hamstrings. Tight hamstrings are a very common complaint that so many people suffer from. But while most of the world and most thought processes look at trying to loosen the hamstrings directly, we have a different perspective that we are going to be sharing with you. And it has nothing to do with actually trying to loosen the hamstrings up, but can be much more effective at loosening the hamstrings up.
Yeah, Charlie, I'm so excited about this conversation because this is one of the, a really common symptom that we hear a lot about. And also the problem with this symptom is that often people blame it on things that they can't control. Things like, it's not like, oh, just change my diet and my hamstrings will loosen up, or change my exercise and my hamstrings will change. It's more like, well, I'm tall, so I have tight hamstrings. Or, I'm just not a flexible person. That is one of the hardest mindsets to work with, because then it gives you no options. It's like, oh, great, well, let's just make you shorter. That's impossible. Let's just make you a flexible person. That's impossible. But we do have a lot of techniques and a lot of very potent techniques to change what's going on in your body, no matter how tall you are, no matter what grade of flexibility you have labeled yourself as, because tight hamstrings are independent, actually, of your height, and they are independent of your flexibility status.
That's right. Now, if you've heard our podcast at all, you know that we do not promote the idea of trying to relax muscles directly by traditional means, trying to stretch them, trying to loosen them up, because we believe there is a reason why your tight muscles are tight. They're not there by mistake. They're there purposefully. They are intentionally placed there by your body. And so our train of thought is figure out the reason why they are there. It's likely not due to a lack of stretching. It's likely not due to you outgrowing your hamstrings. It's likely not due to just some genetic disposition that you may or may not have as to your hamstrings being tight. What we see more times than not is what it's due to is your body is tightening up your hamstrings to try to compensate or make up for other areas of your body that aren't able to tighten up, that are too loose, so to speak. And by figuring out where in your body you have muscles that are too loose, that are too weak, that aren't able to tighten up enough, that your hamstrings are constantly having to compensate around, now all of a sudden we can go and strengthen those muscles. And what we see is the hamstrings loosen up as a result.
The feeling of flexibility, the feeling of, when I move, I just feel mobile, I feel free. And the opposite being like, oh, I'm tight, I'm restricted, there's some pain, there's, discomfort when I'm moving. Those would be like the opposites. The one that we all seek to have, which is like the freedom of movement, feeling of like flexibility or mobility, it's easy to move. That is not achieved by loose muscles. That is actually achieved when all muscles are participating appropriately, when everyone's pulling their own weight, basically. And so this idea that tightness is, having tight muscles is bad, is actually kind of interesting, because when all muscles are appropriately tight, that's when it feels the best. That's when we're asymptomatic. That's when we move freely. We feel flexible. We're not in pain when we move our knee like that, or your hip like that, or whatever it is. But what is uncomfortable when there's this imbalance, right? When some muscles, like what Charlie was saying, when some muscles can't tighten up, other muscles really tighten up, because they're trying to now overcome or overtake or protect these areas that can't tighten up. And so we know that muscles contract and they respond to signals from our nervous system. When our brain and our nervous system tells muscles to squeeze, they squeeze. And when our brain tells muscles to not squeeze, they don't squeeze. But when a muscle is staying tight, it is also there because the nervous system is telling it to be there. That's where we get this thing where, hey, tight muscles are not there by mistake. It's not our job to try to just take them out of the picture. But what we can do when we're thinking about the muscles is try to create an environment of strength, right? To create this environment of stability where those ones that are really tight trying to overtake the other ones are no longer present, right? And so they go away, actually, tight muscles go away by themselves when we create an environment of stability, when we create an environment of strength. But the hard part about this story is that, meanwhile, we have a very distracting symptom, which is tightness. And today, of course, we're talking about really, really tight hamstrings. Some people get them all the time, and they've also labeled themselves as a tight hamstringer person because they're there all the time. And they might be there because you might be addressing them in the same way every time. Most people we talk to that have chronic tight muscles are finding new modalities, new things to try to continue to remove the tightness. It's like, I do this technique to remove tightness. I do this technique to remove tightness. But what we want to suggest is we got to switch the lens to, hey, well, why is that tightness there? Usually because of some type of instability or weakness. Even if you're a really strong person, even if you work out all the time, this is probably happening if you have your tight hamstrings. So instead, we want to suggest, hey, let's solve this problem by creating an environment of stability and strength rather than approaching it in the idea of remove tightness.
Exactly. Okay, so how do you go about doing that? Well, the first thing we want to suggest is to stop doing the things that seem to aggravate your hamstrings or seem to make them tighter, okay? Those activities that you're doing, whether it's sitting for long periods of time or standing for long periods of time, moving for long periods of whatever it is, whatever you're doing that you find that after you do it, your hamstrings feel tighter. There's something about that at some level is too much for your body. It's too stressful for your body. And because of that, your body is perceiving a threat, is perceiving that there is some vulnerability within your system. And so it is trying to protect you by tightening up your hamstrings to say, hey, we need to stop doing this, or we need to stop trying to move as far, or we need to stop trying to push ourselves as hard, whatever it is, right? So that's number one, is if you can stop doing the things that are causing or creating the tightness, that will go a long way to actually helping to relieve a lot of what you're experiencing. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, the stuff that I'm doing that is creating the tightness, I have to do it throughout my day. I have a 45-minute drive to work, and, that's the thing that seems to set off my hamstrings. Oh, okay, well, we're not saying don't drive to work, but so that's where steps 2 and step 3 come into play. So if you have the opportunity to stop or reduce or limit, your exposure to the thing, that you can say, after I do this, that's when my hamstrings feel really tight, that is a definite step 1 to take.
That's right. And to piggyback on this idea of stop doing the things that aggravate your hamstrings is you may also, if you are into this, you may also investigate which parts of what you're doing is aggravating your hamstrings. For example, let's say that when you walk, you get really irritated hamstrings. And you know what? A lot of times people that have tight hamstrings, they do something else with the walking. And that is maybe some leg swings or something that might be part of the walking that is irritating. So you could still walk, but manipulate one part. Or, for example, when you do your yoga class, you're like, man, it just really tightened up right after I leave yoga. One of the things that we find is that because tightness is there to protect, if we take our bodies and try to remove the tightness, just trying to remove it without solving the strength issue, the instability issue, then your body really tries to replace it very quickly and sometimes more aggressively once you finish doing that removal activity. So a lot of times the removal activity, it can feel decent in the moment, but then after your body's like, oh great, she stopped doing that. Boom, 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 boom. Here's all the protection again. So be mindful of how far you're pushing, for example, ranges or yoga poses. Maybe go less far into range and see how that feels. Because a lot of times, again, when we're actively doing things that are yanking, pulling, aggravating, trying to remove this intentional tightness that your body has placed, this intentional protection that your body has placed, oftentimes it will come back and replace that protection with even more protection and more intensity of tightness. Because tightness, when we think about it, what do we do when we are tight? We literally, in our brains, have to convince ourselves to try to feel that tightness. We actually want to avoid the tightness. It feels more comfortable to not feel all that tightness because it's painful, it's uncomfortable, it's not, an ease of movement. And so it's actually, that's where your body wants you to stop for the time being. And so again, remember, it's time being, meaning it's a temporary, it's a changeable thing. So just be mindful of how far you're moving, how much you're aggravating this tightness, and if you can stop doing it, then that would be a great place to start in terms of changing the tight hamstring situation you have going on.
Exactly. Now, the second step is to start getting muscle activation techniques, okay? The reason why MAT is so important within this process is because the MAT process will start to identify where within your body you have these underactive muscles. You have these muscles that your hamstrings are compensating for, whether it's glutes that are underactive or hip flexors that are underactive or something in your core that's underactive or something, in your calves or feet that are underactive. And because of that, your hamstrings are tightening up. Look, your hamstrings can be influenced by so many different areas of your body. It's really incredible. In fact, I remember a couple years into my personal training career, we had a guy come to the gym that I was working at, and he was demonstrating this machine that he had developed. And he's like, we see that, with this machine, hamstring activity goes up, however many percent. And it's like, okay, yeah, but your hamstrings should always be, like the activity of your hamstrings should always be there because of how much they have to do and how many areas of your body they can influence. Again, we're talking about ankles, we're talking about knees, we're talking about hips, we're talking about, spine, low back, core, all of that can have an influence on your hamstrings, and your hamstrings have the opportunity to influence all of that as well. So with this second step, when it comes to implementing the MAT process, we'll be able to get really dialed in with what's going on specific to your body and your system to figure out exactly which groups of muscles aren't functioning as well as they should, and thereby influencing or contributing to what you're experiencing as tight hamstrings.
You know what the coolest part about MAT is, Charlie, in my opinion, is when you get past the symptom reduction and you get to the maintenance work. Reason why? No, I get it. Maintenance work is way less exciting because you're like, yeah, we're just doing the same stuff over and over again, but it's not really. So when people come to get MAT, usually there's something bothering them, right? Tight hamstrings is a great example. So the first thing is that we identify, well, what muscles, again, are not tightening or not functioning or not squeezing that are causing the hamstrings to tight and be squeezed and feel funky all the time, right? We solve that problem. There we go. But here's the thing. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably have chronically tight hamstrings, meaning that you like to do a lot of activities in your life that trigger this scenario to come back. And so the cool thing with MAT is not only does it, number one, solve the problem initially in terms of finding what is weak, what is not neurologically connected, but it also raises the tolerance of your whole body. What does that mean? That means in the maintenance work that you feel like is like, oh my gosh, we're doing the same thing over and over again. But outside of the sessions, you're not doing the same thing over and over again. Meaning now you get to go to yoga class and you don't get to leave with ticked off hamstrings. Now you can go for your run and you don't have to end feeling like, oh my gosh, my hamstrings are now tweaked, right? It increases the level of stress that your muscles can handle before they shut down and return to that protective mechanism. And that's what we want to see in life. What we find with people that have they label themselves as, I'm just getting old, it means that they're falling into this pattern way too much of like, I do some stuff, and then I have this response of like, what we see is it's a neuromuscular imbalance, and so now some stuff is really tight, some stuff is not tight at all. And remember, what we're seeking is that there's appropriate tightness in everything. So once we are with MAT, the cool part is that not only are we able to change the environment that your tight hamstrings live in, which then makes it an environment that tight hamstrings don't have to live in, then we want to start building up the tolerance so that you're doing more. You're going faster on your ski trips. You're getting on the floor more easily with your grandkids. Whatever the activity is, we want to build your body's tolerance to handle that stress. Because in reality, everything we do, whether we call it rehabilitative or a workout or a lifestyle or a fun trip, whatever it is, it's a tax on our body. And we want to see that through MAT, we're building up your ability to handle that type of tax because, in our opinion, that's what life is all about, being able to do the stuff you want to do when you want to do them without so much negative repercussion.
Exactly. Now, this leads us right to step number 3, which is to start to strengthen the areas of your body that we're finding to be lagging behind, including potentially your hamstrings. Okay. And so it's not that the hamstrings don't need to be addressed, but how they are often addressed as far as stretching, relaxing, releasing, usually is not the way that they actually need to be addressed. They need to be addressed more from a strengthening perspective, okay, as well as from an MAT perspective. And so that really comes with step 2 and with step 3. But depending on what is found during your MAT session, and as well as like the overall state of your hamstrings, really starting to strengthen the different areas that are lagging behind through the core, through the hips, with the quads and hamstrings, as well as like the feet and ankles, calves, everything like that. Doing consistent strength training throughout those entire areas can, like Julie was saying, help to not only build upon the work that's done with MAT, but also help to build up the tolerance of your muscles to outside forces, to additional stress, to doing the things that you want to be able to do on a consistent basis.
Yeah, when we think about muscles, and we're thinking about the strength of them, like Charlie just brought up our step 3, strengthen the muscles, strengthen the areas around the hamstrings and the hamstrings. There are 2 components of having muscles that are strong. Number 1 is that they have proper neural input, which we deal with the muscle activation techniques. We want to make sure that you don't have inhibited muscles, that muscles are receiving signal from the brain. But step 2 is that we want to also see that, hey, you are building the conditioning, the endurance, the strength of all these muscles. And that's where like traditional strength training comes in. And so when we're thinking like, okay, so what areas do I strengthen? We could say, hey, you should strengthen your total body. Like everything should be strengthened. We could say that. But what are the areas that are really direct with the hamstrings? Well, when you think about the hamstrings, they are a hip muscle and they are a knee muscle directly, right? That means that they cross the hip, right under your butt cheek, and then they cross your knee on the backside right into your tibia, your lower shin bone. And so when we think about, okay, well, what would that affect, right? So first, you got to be strengthening your hamstrings. You can do that by doing knee flexion exercises, that's knee bending. You can do that by doing hip extension exercises. So hip extension, squats, anything that is pressing the leg behind you. But then, because they are both a hip and a knee muscle, we have to think about, hey, these might be getting triggered, these might be getting tight, and they're probably getting tight because of the weak and unstable environment. So what does that environment mean? It means keeping your entire hip strong. And when we talk about hips, you can't exclude the spine, because here's the thing, the hamstrings feed right into your ischial tuberosity. So your butt bone, like when you're sitting right now, you feel those bones hitting your seat. That's where your hamstrings attach, and that is your pelvis. And the pelvis is the base of your spine. And so keeping your core stable, we have so many core podcasts. Make sure you're strengthening your core in all of the 4 motions of your core. Make sure you're keeping your hip strong. We need to be strengthening hip flexion, hip abduction, hip adduction. We need to make sure we're doing hip extension. Obviously, we already talked about that one. We need to make sure we're strengthening knee flexion. And hamstrings are not the only knee flexors or knee benders, we could think. So also that would be gastrocs, which is like your calves, which then leads you down into your ankles. And the ankle is the bottom side of the tibia, which the hamstring's attached to. So when we're thinking about creating a stable and strong environment for these hamstrings to live in so that they don't have to be tight, we got to make sure we're getting our MAT to check on, are these muscles receiving neural information? And number 2, keeping the areas strong. We're thinking core, we're thinking hips, we're thinking knees, and we're thinking ankles and feet.
Exactly. Now, if your hamstrings are tight, if they are feeling tight, if they have chronically felt tight, it's not because you're not stretching them enough. And it's not because you outgrew your hamstrings and you're too tall. What it is likely due to are issues with strength. And like Julie was saying, the first part of strength is that connection piece. The second part of strength is the output conditioning piece, okay? And so if you are experiencing tight hamstrings, we need to make sure that all of those pieces are considered, all right? Step 1 is to, if you can, stop doing the things that are aggravating your hamstrings, and then start to get into being more proactive about addressing what may be causing your tight hamstrings, which is number 1, the connection piece. Not only the connection aspect of the hamstrings themselves, but have a lot of different areas of your body that can influence your hamstrings, including your core, your hips, your other knee muscles, and your ankles and feet. Okay, that is where MAT comes into play. That is our specialty here at Muscle Activation Schaumburg. And then after that, we want to make sure that you are strengthening. That's that output, that's that conditioning piece that Julie talked about, okay? And that is where doing really specific exercises for the muscles that are lagging behind, for the muscles that are needing to get worked on, that you got worked on from an MAT perspective, and for all the other muscles as well to make sure that they stay strong, that they stay conditioned. Not only will this help you tolerate the activities that you're wanting to do better, so they're not as stressful to your body, they're going to help make sure that your hamstrings stay better supported, so your hamstrings aren't having to continuously compensate for all the other issues and all the other areas of your body that are lagging behind. So if you are wanting to experience muscle activation techniques for yourself and you are in the Chicagoland area or are willing to travel to the Chicagoland area to us here at Muscle Activation Schaumburg, all you have to do to check our availability and get on our schedule is go to www.matschaumburg.com. We have a big green button that says Get Started. You can click that and you can schedule yourself for your initial consultation and assessment. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that has had tight hamstrings for quite some time now? And no matter how much they stretch, no matter how much they roll, no matter how much their hamstrings get rubbed on, their hamstrings are still tight. Share this episode with them so they can understand the role that strength is likely playing in what they are experiencing and how to go improving the strength not only of their hamstrings but throughout their entire body as well. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us and leave us a rating and review. Not only does it help people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise, it also helps them find our podcast when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.